Hey guys, how's everyone doing? This is Sir Jedi Sentinel, and welcome back to Sentinel Reviews. I'm just doing something different once again, expanding into something new and seeing how it works. As you can see from the title below, I have finally started watching Star Trek. It took me long enough, to say the least. Bit of my history with this. My dad is into both of the seminal sci-fi franchises. He got me into Star Wars at a young age, and that's where mostly I've been on the sci-fi side of things. He never really got me into Star Trek. I've tried on occasions without much success. Most of what I know from Star Trek is due to pop culture and the pop cultural zeitgeist. But it's not been, I'm not completely blind. For example, I've seen the movies. I've seen the TOS and TNG movies. I have not seen the Kelvin movies yet. I keep meaning to remedy that. And if you want my thoughts on that, my favorite movie is Star Trek 6, The Undiscovered Country, but it has been a while since I've seen them, so I really need to again. I have seen some episodes of TOS, TNG, and DS9. I haven't seen any Voyager, the animated series, or Enterprise. I actually started trying to watch Star Trek right at the tail end of its time on Netflix before they moved to Paramount Plus, back when Paramount Plus was still CBS All Access. But now, thanks to password sharing with my aunt, we have a Paramount Plus account, and I am finally giving it a proper chance. As you can see from the title below, I have decided my foray into Star Trek will be Lower Decks. And today we're going to talk about Season 1, but we're going to do it in kind of a different way. First of all, let me say, I absolutely love Lower Decks. I am more than halfway through Season 2 right now. I have been enjoying it tremendously. It is great. But I figure my way of talking about this, because seasons are 10 episodes, is a ranking video. So this is my ranking for the episodes of Season 1 of Lower Decks. Everything presented is my opinion. You know how these work, so without further ado, we're just gonna jump right into it. I will be switching to voiceover now because it just gives me more time to record. Like, I can leave for a little bit and come back, or I can do this across multiple days. It just gives me more free time and free reign of what I need to do. Other benefits of recording voiceover include the fact that I can record in stereo, whereas when I record in OBS, I have to record in mono and then have to edit it into stereo. This just eliminates an extra step. Also, I can edit while I'm recording voiceover, unlike with video where I have to edit after the fact, so it's just more beneficial for me all around. Anyway, let's start this ranking properly now with number 10, what I think was the weakest episode of Season 1 for me, Episode 5, Cupid's Errant Arrow. Before we begin properly, I want to say, again, I'm more than halfway through Season 2 at the time of recording this. I don't think there is a bad episode of Lower Decks. Some episodes are weaker than others, certainly, and there are episodes where things that happen in them I take issue with, but no episode is outright bad. That being said, I think Cupid's Errant Arrow is the weakest episode of this season, and that's mostly due to the A-plot. To sum up, this episode sees the crew of the Cerritos team up with another starship to implode a planet's moon before it crashes into the planet itself. On this other starship, we learn that Brad Boimler has a girlfriend, a girl Beckett is surprisingly suspicious of, based on her own personal history of situations like this. The B-plot also sees Rutherford and Tendi sort of competing to get new technology in a storyline that spirals out of control in the most hilarious way possible, while the C-plot sees the bridge crew of the Cerritos, Captain Freeman, Jack Ransom, Shax, and Dr. Ta'ana, deal with the imploding of this moon. The B-plot is okay. Only about halfway through when we get kind of our twist reveal does it start getting really good, and the C plot is great. The B and C plots are really what saved this episode for me. My problems are all with the A plot. As I said, in this plot, it turns out the ship the Cerritos is working with has Boimler's girlfriend, and because of past experiences, Beckett is very suspicious of her, she thinks she's a shapeshifter or something, and she's acting out of what she thinks is Boimler's best interest. Meanwhile, Boimler learns that his girlfriend is exes with another member of the Cerritos, and he starts to become incredibly jealous. This leads to Beckett stalking Boimler and his girlfriend, and Boimler trying to quote-unquote improve himself to be more like his girlfriend's ex in this jealous panic. And I'm sorry, this is something I see in fiction a lot, especially in more domestic series like sitcoms. I always find this storyline incredibly cringy. It was so bad, I actually had to watch this episode in chunks. When I sit down to watch an episode of Lower Decks, because they're 25 minutes, I can watch one or two in a sitting, but the relationship comedy and the jealousy and whatever Beckett was doing was all so cringy, I had to watch this episode in chunks. Hey, this is Sir Jedi Sentinel from the editing room real quick. When I was putting this together, I noticed there was something I forgot to say, so there is one more thing I want to say about Cupid's errant arrow. I don't like how this episode treats Boimler. Yes, as sort of the resident brown-noser and kiss-up, Boimler is often the butt of the joke. But the characters and the show itself never make sure to degrade him for it. They never depreciate him. It always makes you know it's all in good fun. And that's one of my other major problems with this episode, that after everything gets resolved, Boimler's girlfriend breaks up with him. So the way this episode handles this plotline, as well as the way this plotline ends, it just feels like it's a lot of punching down, which kind of leaves a sour taste in my mouth. Especially given the way, as I just said, the way the rest of the show treats Boimler. Number 9. Episode 7. Much Ado About Boimler. I really have issues with the character development in this episode. Keep in mind, as I just said, this is episode 7, so this is the tail end of season 1. Like, we're winding down towards the finale. And the character beats we get here and some of the progressing character development we get here feels like, in the grand scheme of what we saw in season 1, ultimately doesn't work, or it feels out of place. Like, maybe this episode would have been better if it happened earlier in the season, but just mainly where it is now and what we've seen with the characters in question, this episode I take some issues with, especially with Mariner. Heads up, I feel like because I'm doing this unscripted, I am going to constantly flip between calling her Beckett and Mariner, whereas everyone else I'm going to generally get right, Boimler, Rutherford, and Tendi. Once again, too, this is an episode where the B plot is much better than the A plot, because the A plot is, again, where most of my issues are coming from. So in this episode, the Cerritos is dispatched to take care of a top secret, I believe it's some kind of agricultural mission on this planet. And while the bridge crew is away doing this top secret mission, there is going to be an acting captain in their place. This captain is an old friend of Mariner's from Starfleet. Meanwhile, Tendi has engineered a dog who she calls the Dog, but this is only based on what she knows from essentially word of mouth from stories about Earth dogs, because the Dog is nothing like a dog. She's been enhanced with all these abilities. She is absolutely horrifying, and it's played for laughs. Also, as part of the B plot, Boimler is helping Rutherford improve the transporter, which leads to a transporter accident where Boimler is out of shift. This leads to Boimler and the Dog, along with Tendi, being sent on a medical ship to a facility called the Farm. And as I said, the B plot is the best part of the episode. Although I do have one little nitpick about that. It feels like when we separate into the various plot lines of the episode, it was always the same grouping. The A plot would be Mariner and Boimler, the B plot would be Tendi and Rutherford, and the C plot, when we had one, would be the bridge crew. Freeman, Ransom, Shax, and Ta'ana. It feels like this episode is trying to address that critique, because this is a critique a lot of people had with season 1. The problem is the way it does it is really superficial. So both Boimler and the Dog are going to the farm, and because the Dog was engineered by Tendi, Tendi is going with them. However, it's not really the Tendi-Boimler team-up. Instead, Tendi is mostly doing her own thing and doesn't really interact with Boimler throughout the course of this plotline. Now let's get to my big problem with this, the A-plot. As I said, the acting captain, while the bridge crew is on this top secret mission, is an old friend of Mariner's, so she recruits Mariner to be part of her team during this mission. And over the course of this mission, Mariner keeps screwing up. She forgets vital materials, she doesn't know the proper protocol to do things, etc., etc. It's eventually revealed that Mariner is sabotaging herself because she realized her friend would try to recruit her to be a part of her crew at a higher rank. And this is where my problems come in, because this does not feel like something Mariner would do. Yes, Mariner is lazy. She hates Starfleet's protocols. She has virtually no respect for the chain of command. But when push comes to shove, she knows what her duty is and performs her tasks. So the fact she spends this episode sabotaging herself intentionally, this is not something Mariner would do. Like I said, if this aired at the beginning of the season when Mariner was a little bit more of a loose cannon, she's never not a loose cannon, but that's just the best terminology I can come up with. Maybe this would have worked better, but this is really where most of my hangups are. This characterization of Mariner trying to sabotage herself. It doesn't work, and as I said, it feels out of character for who Beckett Mariner is. Number 8, Episode 6, Terminal Provocations. This is another episode with 3 plot lines: an A plot with Mariner and Boimler, a B plot with Rutherford and Tendi, and a C plot with the bridge crew. And this is another episode where I have a lot of hang-ups with the A plot, to the point that, like Cupid's errant arrow, I find it really cringy. What puts this episode above the other two is that the B plot really saves it. I have a lot of issues with the A and C plots, though. Not so much with the C plot because it's really short, but the A plot I have issues with. Like Cupid's errant arrow, I find this really cringy, but for different reasons. Cupid's errant arrow, it's just a plot line I don't like. Here in Terminal Provocations, it's because of real-world experiences. The quick rundown of this episode is that the Cerritos is caught in a salvage dispute with some scavengers over Starfleet debris. This is just a starship crash that's over hundreds of years old. Starfleet has staked a claim to it, but because it's hundreds of years old and abandoned, these scavengers feel they have a right to it. This is just the framing device for ultimately what's going to happen in this episode. Mainly that Boimler and Mariner are helping a new ensign on the Cerritos, Ensign Fletcher. And after a very promising introduction, Fletcher is able to talk down Dr. T'Ana after she really wants to kill Mariner for ruining her meal. I really do not like Ensign Fletcher, and his entire plotline is why I do not like this episode in particular, or at least why I find this so cringy, because I have dealt with people like this in my own line of work. You know, the person who somehow still keeps their job even though they are so incompetent, you constantly need to help them. Their heart's in the right place, but no matter what you do, you just get really frustrated with them. I'm not going to name names, but it reaches a point where they screw up so spectacularly, it's your neck on the line if they get caught. And that's really my problem with this episode. This rings so close to home for me. It's just, I'll talk about the C plot next, because that's also where some of my hangups on this episode are. And then I'll end with the B plot, because I want to end on a positive note here. So, the entire time, the bridge crew of the Cerritos is dealing with these scavengers, and they start attacking them. They start attacking the Cerritos. And Captain Freeman refuses to do anything about it. She just has them take the beating. At one point, she even says, "Ooh, these guys are lucky, I'm so ethical." And that particular line really kind of highlights my problems with the C plot. In this episode, the bridge crew feels more like parodies. Like, yes, Lower Decks is a parody of Star Trek set in the Star Trek universe, but they are still their own characters. And there is still a weight and a gravitas and a sense of consequence to what they do. And it just feels like this episode, they're just played more for parody. They're parodies of themselves more than anything. Like I said, the B plot is really what saves this episode, though. So Tendi learns that part of collecting this salvage may involve having to do a spacewalk, but because of an oversight at the Academy, she never got tested or trained how to spacewalk. Luckily, Rutherford has been working on a holodeck simulation that sort of functions as an FAQ to help train her. And we meet Rutherford's program, Badgie. Now, allegedly, I've seen people make the comparison. I don't know if it's actually what it's supposed to be. Badgie is a parody of Clippy. You know, if you ever used Microsoft Office prior to 2007, Microsoft Word, Microsoft Excel. Remember? Do you need some help with that? That's what Badgie is. The B plot is our holodeck shenanigans episode. You know, those episodes where because of some error or glitch or something, the holodeck malfunctions and everything in it becomes real? Well, Badgie is still in his beta phase, so Rutherford gets really frustrated when he starts glitching and malfunctioning. And then when the holodeck malfunctions, Badgie becomes real, and because of this abuse, he wants to kill Rutherford and Tendi. This entire plotline goes to extremes, and it's absolutely hilarious in the best way possible. This episode is almost worth it just for this plotline alone. Number 7, Episode 4, Moist Vessel. The Cerritos is tasked with investigating a derelict generation ship. After embarrassing her during the mission briefing, Captain Freeman has reached her breaking point with Mariner and decides to assign her the most grueling, horrible, difficult tasks on the Cerritos in an effort to get her to quit and ask for a reassignment. Meanwhile, Tendi gets the opportunity to watch one of her more religious shipmates ascend onto the next plane of being, only to end up accidentally ruining the ascension ceremony, leading her to want to make things right. Really, I have no major issues with this episode. It's good, it's really good, just for me personally, this is the least memorable episode of the season. Not to say there's anything bad here, just I had to really rack my brain to try and remember this one. And when I looked online and kind of reread plot summaries and stuff to remember and refresh my memory, this is the one I went, oh yeah, that's the one where this happened. Again, there's nothing bad in this episode, and in fact, there's some great stuff. Like, we finally get some advancement on the plot line from the first episode about the relationship between Captain Freeman and Beckett Mariner. Not just being a captain and an ensign, but also being a mother and a daughter. We're going to talk about that more a little later down the list, but it is a nice progression on both their plot lines and the development of their relationship. The Tendi plot line is great. Also because it's something that rings true to me personally. I hate it when people do not like me. And it really bugs me, just the way it does Tendi. Also, the culmination of that plot line is horrifically hilarious. I don't want to spoil it. You should just see what happens. Number 6, Episode 1, Second Contact. We've now reached the really difficult part of this ranking. As I said, I don't believe there are any bad episodes of Star Trek Lower Decks. There were just episodes that I took issue with certain aspects of, but the episodes on the whole were still enjoyable. I wouldn't say they were bad, I wouldn't say I hated them, they're certainly not the worst things I've ever seen. But here's the thing. It was just those 3 episodes. From here on out, I don't really have any critiques of the episodes I've watched. From here on out, the ranking is more a case of just, oh, I like this next episode more than I like the previous one. And when you're doing a ranking video or any kind of ranking, I always find just basing it on that premise alone makes the entries incredibly difficult to talk about. With that being said, now let's talk about Second Contact, the season 1 and series premiere. And boiling it down to the bare bones, this is a very mechanical episode. Now what I mean by that is it accomplishes everything a series premiere sets out to do. The characters are introduced really well. Their personalities are strong enough that they're established right off the bat. And the inaugural episode introduces the mission statement and the premise of the show really well. If anything, and that's a big if, I'd probably say the one real weak point is the humor of this episode. There are plenty of jokes, and it is hilarious, but it feels a little shaky, a little rough around the edges. Like, it never crosses lines or goes into anything outright offensive, but it feels like it's trying to do that edgy, raunchy adult humor approach that a lot of adult animation does. I've seen a lot of people compare this episode to Rick and Morty, though I think that's more the animation style. But I've also seen people base their entire opinion on whether or not they're going to do this show based on this episode alone, which, big mistake. Watch it, it's great. But I would say if you watch this episode and decide Lower Decks is not for you, I would honestly say give episode 2 a chance, or even episode 3. Like TOS or TNG, Lower Decks is very episodic. There's no overarching plot lines. There's some character arc stuff, but it's very superbly, subtly done. So skipping an episode means you won't lose anything. And I have to say, for what little Trek I've seen, I honestly think this is the best episode 1 of any Trek series. And in broader terms, I've even heard people say Lower Decks breaks the season 1 curse. Because I've heard most Trek fans say that season 1 of any Trek show is the worst in that show's run. That doesn't seem to be the case with Lower Decks. A lot of people say the first season of Lower Decks is actually really good. And what happened after Lower Decks? Strange New Worlds. Number 5, Episode 2, Envoys. While Boimler and Mariner are tasked with escorting a Klingon delegate to a Starfleet summit, Rutherford decides to leave engineering and experiment with joining different departments if it means spending more time with Tendi. Like I said, while I think Second Contact is a really good introduction to the show, it accomplishes what it sets out to do. It introduces the characters, it establishes their personalities and their chemistry and their dynamics. It also introduces the show's premise and its mission statement. I do think it does come off as kind of mechanical. I think Envoys flows much more organically, and it serves as a much better introduction to the show. And like I said too, I've just seen a lot of people say they were put off by the first episode. I think episode 2 is a much better jumping on point. Actually, if it weren't for the fact that Second Contact opens with Tendi joining the Cerritos, I would actually say watch Envoys first and then watch Second Contact. But because of continuity, you can't really do that. It just goes to show that I think Envoys is a much stronger introduction. Like, now that we know who these characters are, the kitty gloves kind of come off and we can see these characters in their natural environment. Like, we see Mariner more as the wild card that she is in this episode. And we see Boimler as her counter, her foil, or Tendi being the bright-eyed, innocent optimist that she is. Or we really see Rutherford's first love is engineering. I'm going to repeat myself just one more time. It really boils down to Envoys is doing the same thing Second Contact did. It's just doing it more organically, with a better flow than Second Contact. Number 4, Episode 10, No Small Parts, the season finale. Now we're getting into the really good stuff. Number 10 through 8 were good episodes, but episodes I had issues with. 7 through 5 were just good or even great episodes, but these last 4 are my favorite episodes of the season. I loved all of them, starting with the season finale. While I try to recap these episodes as quick as possible, I'm trying to make sure to be as scant as possible to not give anything away, because I do really want people to check out Lower Decks if they haven't. While I tease there's going to be a big spoiler or a plot twist, I don't want to actually give it away or say what it is to ruin the surprise. That being said, I kind of do have to talk about it for this one because it's the screenshot I selected for this episode. While rescuing another ship, the Cerritos is attacked by an old foe. Not an old foe from Lower Decks, just an old foe from Star Trek in general. And ultimately, at the end of the episode, in the form of a Deus Ex Machina, they are saved by the USS Titan, captained by one William Riker. So in this episode, we get cameos from Jonathan Frakes and Marina Citrus, who are, of course, both just great. Beyond that, though, this is just a really well done, well structured season finale, not just for Lower Decks, but in general. All the plot threads and the notes of character development we've been laying throughout this season reach their zenith in this episode, and it's glorious. In particular, the ongoing plot thread about the relationship between Mariner and her mother, Captain Freeman. I want to take a moment to comment on this as well. I love optimistic sci-fi. I think sci-fi is at its best when it's optimistic. Optimistic sci-fi is better than dystopian sci-fi. And this is just one of those small ways I think Lower Decks really handles that optimistic sci-fi note. Because as I kind of mentioned, Mariner is Captain Freeman's daughter, and her dad is also a high-ranking admiral in Starfleet. Mariner is a nepotism baby who absolutely despises the fact she's a nepotism baby. Like, we see she did not want anyone to know Captain Freeman was her daughter, and we see why. She hates it. People think currying favor with her will curry favor with Captain Freeman. And Mariner would also rather be recognized for her own skills and merits rather than just being the daughter of high-ranking Starfleet commanders. There are other things, of course, as well, like Boimler's brown-nosing pays off, Rutherford's engineering skills are put to the test, and even Tendi gets to introduce a new recruit the same way she was introduced back in episode 1. This is a really good wham episode. A wham episode is an episode of a show that permanently shakes up the status quo. You know, to qualify as a wham episode, the status quo of the show has to be altered. It's not a reset button, and it can't have all been a dream. The changes have to be permanent. And the way this episode goes, and the way season 2 kind of went for a little bit, you get the feeling like this episode has weight to it. Number 3. Coincidentally enough, episode 3. Temporal Edict. At its core, science fiction is at its best when it's used as a critique or commentary on what is happening in the modern day world. And that is one of the things Temporal Edict does so well. This episode is a commentary on the employer abuse of employees and workforce abuse. Worried that the Cerritos is seen as a joke, Captain Freeman tries to improve its credibility and its standing by improving its efficiency, and she decides to do this by putting in new rules to eliminate buffer time. The episode explains it better than I can, but buffer time is essentially fudging the numbers. Like, if your employer asks you, how long is this job going to take you to do, you'll say, oh, it'll take me an hour, even though it'll only really take you 30 to 40 minutes. The idea being that, 1, you look more impressive when you finish the job. Cable and internet companies do this all the time. When the power goes out or something and you call them asking for an estimate on how long it'll take to get fixed, they'll say it'll take like 7 hours and then they'll have it done in 50 minutes. But 2, that overestimation is also to give you a little bit of break and relaxation time, which is really the focus of this episode. By eliminating that buffer time, Freeman has her crew pushed to their limits because they don't get breaks. They don't get time off. Boy, that sounds familiar in the 21st century, doesn't it? The crew of the Cerritos is pushed to their physical and mental limits. And because they're still working without a chance to recuperate, they're getting sloppy. This, of course, culminates in a horrible second contact mission where, due to everyone's exhaustion, they accidentally offend an alien race, which leads to everyone being imprisoned and either Ransom or Mariner having to fight a giant in a pit. Which I want to comment on that. In this episode, the relationship between Ransom and Mariner is interesting. Keep in mind, this is episode 3, so the fact that Mariner is Captain Freeman's daughter is not public knowledge yet, and Ransom is Freeman's number 1. He is her Riker. And I just found their dynamic in this episode really interesting. They kind of have this begrudging respect for each other. They obviously can't stand each other, but at the same time, they both weirdly admire each other. Like, while she's watching Ransom fight this giant in this pit arena, Mariner wonders if she's aroused by it. And at the end of the episode, while Mariner's recuperating in the sickbay, Ransom sends Mariner to the brig for not following orders. And Mariner lashes out and throws a fit as she's dragged away, which Ransom begins to question why he found that arousing. I kind of lost the plot, so I'm going to end this by being cringy for a second. Nothing has come of it yet, and this is the only episode where their dynamic has really been brought up, but I kind of ship it. Number 2, Episode 8, Veritas. As I said in the introduction, I'm still new to Star Trek. Most of what I know is not from watching the few scant episodes I've seen, it's from the pop culture zeitgeist. So that being said, I am well familiar with what this episode is doing and what it's spoofing. A trope tried and true to Star Trek. The trial episode. It looks like the bridge crew of the Cerritos is on trial, and it's up to the testimony of the Lower Decks team to seemingly save them. However, everyone has different recollections of what actually happened. I want to call this a Rashomon story, but I don't think that's entirely accurate because Rashomon stories are people telling their own POVs on the same event, whereas this, all the events, all the testimony everyone is telling is linked, but it's not the same event. Like Mariner's testimony is one leg of the story, Rutherford's is the next, and then Tendy's is the next after that. So rather than them all telling the same story from different points of view, they're still telling it from different points of view, but instead, each new person telling the story is actually progressing it. So I don't think it's truly a Rashomon story, but I digress. What's really going on here, and what's the point of this trial? Well, I'm not going to spoil it. Watch the episode. It is tremendous and one of the highlights of Season 1. I mean, in my own personal ranking, it made number 2. Among other things, we get a great guest appearance from Kurtwood Smith, Red Foreman himself, as the apparent prosecutor of this trial. And just, if you've seen the kind of roles Kurtwood Smith usually takes, this role is so out of left field for him, and he is great at it. There is also another guest cameo appearance that I won't spoil, so you'll just have to watch the episode. It's also interesting and fun seeing the 3 different points of view, and Boimler's. I'll talk more about Boimler's at the end, I hope. If I remember, I'll try not to forget. And just how they differ. For example, Mariner's testimony is her going in half-cocked, not knowing the full story, and just winging it, as she always does, with hilarious results. Including one of the few spoilers I'll give, a hilarious misinterpretation of the phrase, "send them a message." Or because Rutherford has cybernetic implants, his testimony is about how Shax asked him to update his database for a mission, but he has to reboot every time he does it, which causes him to go unconscious, and then his implant uses his body of its own accord without him knowing. Or Tendy's, which Tendy's testimony is my favorite. She says she was a part of this top secret mission, so she has to redact some information, and just the redactions she gives absolutely do not have anything classified. For example, some of the characters she's going on this mission with only have little black censor bar rectangles over their eyes, or she's redacting certain words to censor them because this is a top secret mission, but she's really bad at it. Like, one of my favorite scenes is when Ransom is congratulating them all. It's like, we really showed it to the Romu beep yulins, and just things like that. Till finally Boimler's own testimony is just kind of this spilling the tea on everything. In particular, how the bridge crew doesn't necessarily communicate with Lower Decks, both in this series and a meta commentary on greater Star Trek. Because most shows, well, all shows if we're being honest, focus on the bridge crew as the main cast, and Lower Decks really doesn't. Just a great episode all around, and if it weren't for number 1, this would probably have my vote for the funniest episode of the season. And finally, number 1. My favorite episode of Season 1 of Star Trek Lower Decks, Episode 9, Crisis Point. We're doing something slightly different in this episode. While previous episodes, and Lower Decks as a whole, spoof Star Trek and many of its tropes and archetypes, it's been doing so with the various TV iterations of Star Trek. This episode is spoofing the movies, and it's glorious. I think that's also why I like this episode so much, because while I'm only familiar with Star Trek through the cultural zeitgeist and having seen scattered episodes here and there, I have seen all 10 movies. Well, again, the 6 TOS movies and the 4 TNG movies. Still have to see the 3 Kelvin movies. So in other episodes, while there are some references and nods that I certainly missed, this episode, I actually know what they're doing. I have kind of a clear grasp on it. What's the quick rundown on this episode? After their most recent escapades, Captain Freeman decides Mariner needs therapy and kind of forces her to take it, something she greatly resents. Meanwhile, Boimler is getting ready for an interview, which, if successful, would probably land him a promotion. And he's practicing and prepping using the holodeck, because Boimler committed a massive invasion of privacy and uploaded everyone's logs into the holodeck to create as accurate portrayals as he could. And in her enraged state, Mariner decides to hijack this to vent. So she launches this holodeck program, which plays out like the movies, and casts herself as the villain. And aside from the movie spoof just in general being really funny, there are other great notes of humor. For example, Boimler is fighting this program, trying to still brown nose and figure everything he can about the captain in order to ace this interview and get this promotion. But what really makes this episode stand out for me is the character work. We get some really good character progression and character arc stuff here that is just glorious. For example, Tendi is an Orion, and in this movie, Mariner cast her as a henchwoman, so to speak. And, you know, Star Trek and Starfleet depict the Orions as kind of being bloodthirsty pirates, and Mariner keeps asking and goading Tendi to play up that stereotype, something she is deeply disturbed and uncomfortable by. We'd kind of gotten little hints of it all season, but now it really comes to a head that Tendi constantly has to confront and deal with the Starfleet prejudices against Orions in her job and in her life. And we also see Rutherford, who once he gets into this holodeck simulation, he realizes he can tell his boss anything he wants in this, and he just wants to tell him he's awesome, which is funny. But the real highlight of this is Mariner. In this little holodeck simulation movie she's created, she's playing a villain named Vindicta, who wants to kill Captain Freeman. And as she confronts Captain Freeman, and later the holodeck simulation of herself, this sort of epic fight scene brings to light all of Mariner's feelings about her working on the Cerritos, about her feelings about her mother. It brings her insecurities and her fears to life. Like, think about this for a second. In this simulation, Mariner has cast herself of her own volition as the villain. I feel like I hinted pretty strongly at this, if I didn't say it outright earlier in the video, which I don't think I did. Beckett Mariner is my favorite character in Lower Decks. And Tawny Newsome gives one of her best performances as Mariner in this episode. Also, I just love this episode's sense of irony. Mariner did this entire simulation to rail against her mandated therapy, and instead it ended up being very therapeutic for her. This episode is just genius on so many fronts, and I could go on forever, but I'm just gonna end it there. And there you have it, my thoughts on Season 1 of Star Trek Lower Decks. What were your thoughts? Share something in the comments below. Remember to like, comment, subscribe. Click the bell next to subscribe to get notifications when I upload. In the description box below, you'll find the link to my Twitter where you can follow me and get updates on the channel for the time being. I don't know if I'm gonna keep going with these. Do one for series. Sorry, I've been watching a lot of British TV, and they call their seasons series. I don't know if I'm gonna do videos for season 2 and season 3. I might. I'll keep an eye on the analytics, and that'll determine if this goes on. But until then, keep watching the channel. Batman B Vlogged reviews come out every week. And now that we're getting into May, I might start up with Big Finish again. If you follow Big Finish, you know what's starting in May, but we'll just keep an eye on that. So this is your Jedi Sentinel, and I'll see you guys next time.